She's there. She's not. I think that's speakerphone when we're in the car and stuff. She gets a kick out of that. Okay, I don't think there's anything. Presentation.
My brain wasn't working. Yep, wait for Kevin and Jerry. We'll get started.
Hi, nice to see you guys.
You gotta wait for me.
No.
What about Sherry? What about Sherry?
I don't know. Now Sherry's. It's Sherry.
Is she doing well?
Yeah. Gotta wait on Kevin.
We were now.
Sherry can just walk all the way around.
I apologize so much, Kevin. I'm so sorry.
Too late.
Too late.
You said Brittany's coming? Your Chris was this.
We got plenty of time.
I want Thursday.
Yeah, that one sounds.
First, I feel like I got nothing done.
This all good to you.
Good evening. The time is now 6:04, and I'd like to call this ARPA information session to order, and I'll pass it off to Eric Miller.
President. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight to discuss eligibility and ideas about the funding that the City of Beloit received as part of the American Rescue Plan Act. We're going to go over a brief presentation, and then we'll open it up for questions and comments at the end of the presentation. So what is ARPA? ARPA was passed on March 11th, 2021. The American Rescue Plan Act, or ARPA. There should be two up front too. That was signed into law by President Biden on March 11, 2021. This established the Coronavirus State and Local Fiscal Recovery Fund, or SLFRF. Sometimes in the news you might hear LFRF or SFRF, but it basically all means the exact same thing, just state or local fiscal recovery funds. So it is intended to provide support to governments in response to COVID-19. It does provide support to state and local and tribal governments in responding to economic and public health impacts of COVID-19 and their efforts to contain impacts to the community. So the allocation and timeline related to the ARPA funds is the city is designated as an entitlement community under the CDBG, or Community Development Block Grant Program. Under that same allocation or calculation is what was used in order to allocate the funds from ARPA to the City of Beloit. And under this allocation, the city was allocated $15.2 million. We are to receive the money in two equal installments of $7.6 million, roughly a piece. And the funds must be obligated by December 31st, 2024 and spent by December 31st, 2026. We did receive the first installment of $7.6 million in July of this year, so we will receive the second installment of the equal amount in July of 2022. $15.2 million does seem to be sound like a lot of money on the surface. However, if the city were to get 3 times that amount, we'd still be able to very easily spend it and still have more projects that would be eligible. So speaking of eligibility, there are 4 statutory categories of eligibility that were published in the interim final rule to the Rescue Plan Act. Those are to respond to the COVID-19 public health emergency or its negative economic impacts, premium pay to essential workers during the public health emergency, revenue reduction relative to revenues collected in the most recent full fiscal year prior to the emergency, and to make necessary investments in water, sewer, storm, and broadband infrastructure. Governments do have some discretion when it comes to how they are to use the awarded funds, as long as they fit into one of the 4 eligibility criteria. So as we begin to look into some projects, we try to determine what projects to consider, and we'll be looking at the following key decision-making principles. Some of them are that these are just one-time use funds, so we need to make them count. We most likely will never see these types of funds in our lifetime again, so we have to evaluate the long-term impacts in order to have, the most lasting effects on the community. We also look at deferred maintenance because we know that deferred maintenance of infrastructure only increases the cost as you continue to defer it. Other things we looked at were that parks and recs facilities and equipment were used exponentially greater during the COVID-19 pandemic. That, of course, was because you were outside. You were able to social distance a little bit more, and being able to use those facilities might have run them down a little bit faster than what we had originally anticipated. So understanding that they're one-time use funds, this does tie into a sustainability concept, that we want to make sure that we aren't spending money that we would need a long-term funding source to continue the program. We want to make sure that those are just one-time use only. And we want to make sure that we get the biggest bang for our buck for the long-term impacts on the community. So more decision-making process. Again, this is a very deliberate approach. We're not in any hurry to spend the money. We have until December 31 of 2024 in order to commit or obligate those dollars. So we want to make sure that we are taking a very deliberate process to determining what to spend it on. And as I mentioned, the deadline is December 31, 2024. So we do have time to evaluate in order to maximize the long-term range impacts. So other criteria that we look at as possibilities for determining what projects to perform. This is just a small list of criteria, some of them being lead water service replacement. What census tracts are hardest hit by COVID-19 or were hardest hit by COVID-19? What areas of the city have sub 6-inch water mains? What is the history of those water mains? Is there a history of breaking? Do we want to affect the areas that have the highest rate of breakage? What about fire flows, increasing the fire flows in certain areas? Regulatory compliance, roadway conditions, impacting the future economic development and housing, as well as sustainability efforts that I've already mentioned. You take a look at all of these in conjunction with each other and to look at basically a matrix to see which of the projects might overlap multiple categories in this criteria to see what might rank higher or have a higher priority. So as an example of the criteria, we had a map created. This map shows the colored lines on the throughout the city. Those are some of our sub 6-inch water mains that we've identified. But then you also put another layer on top of roadway condition. So as you're replacing water mains, you're of course going to be tearing up the roadways. And so you evaluate what the roadway condition is in that particular area. And we rank those already through our engineering department. So 1 through 3 is in the red. That is the highest need. You overlay that with where there's sub 6-inch water main, and that could then rank a little bit higher from a priority standpoint, where you're basically killing 2 birds with 1 stone in order to get some projects done that achieve multiple uses. So next Monday, the 4th, we will be presenting to City Council our proposed capital improvement plan for the 2022 budget. There are 4 projects that are in the proposed budget that are examples of how ARPA funds could be applied. As you saw on the map, the little black box over on the left-hand side of the screen, That is the Elm Street, Oak Street, Roosevelt Street Design Project, which falls under the infrastructure category of eligibility. There's PD Tactical Operations Equipment, as well as City Hall air handling systems, which fall under the response to negative impacts of COVID-19. And there's also an ambulance replacement, which is in the proposed budget, and that falls under the revenue reduction or COVID response category of eligibility. So these are just some examples of existing projects that we've had in the existing CIP for many years that now could be funded through ARPA instead of through maybe our general obligation debt issuance. So being able to parlay the ARPA funds into our existing plan to eliminate the possibility of needing to borrow some of those monies. So that is my brief presentation on ARPA and some of the examples of eligibility and criteria. So at this point, I'm going to turn it back over to President Anderson to call for public comment.
Yes. Thank you, Eric. At this time, before we begin with the public comment portion, I'll just make a few comments here. We do ask that you limit your public comment portion to 5 minutes. Any questions that you may ask will be written down by our city manager and addressed once we finish the public comment portion. So with that, if anyone would like to speak at this time, you can come forward and state your name and address for the record.
Good evening, Council. I'm Celestino Ruffini, the CEO of Visit Beloit. My home address is 2366 Hyacinth Court here in Beloit. Dear Beloit City Council and City Manager Luther, as a coronavirus local fiscal recovery funds recipient, I'm requesting that you consider including financial support for Visit Beloit, your local destination marketing organization, in your action plan. Tonight's priority is to simply begin the process of presenting our organization as an entity that you can successfully work with to implement projects and plans to recover Beloit's economy. The COVID-19 health crisis has had a devastating and disproportionate impact on the travel and tourism industry, including many organizations like ours that are funded through a combination of local hotel room taxes and private sector contributions. The stay-at-home orders and social distancing measures that were put in place in response to the outbreak have abruptly upended private sector finances and catastrophically reduced hotel room tax revenue. Moreover, the lingering effects of the pandemic have created havoc within the industry's workforce and supply chain. According to current projections, these problems are only expected to continue. According to the data released by the U.S. Travel Association, the domestic travel industry has been devastated by the coronavirus pandemic, with declines in 2020 compared to 2019. And while there are some signs of economic recovery, no sector within our industry has been unaffected, and travel and tourism in every community across the country has suffered. Nationally, travel spending is down nearly $500 billion, costing the U.S. economy $1.1 trillion. The total number of travel support jobs fell by 34%. And prior to the pandemic, total travel support jobs account for 11% of the U.S. workforce, but in 2020, it accounted for a staggering 65% of the national unemployment. At our current pace, the industry is not expected to fully recover until 2025. Here in Beloit, travel spending from 2017 to 2019 increased on average 10.8% each year, whereas in 2020, revenues decreased by 36%. Travel and tourism mean a great deal to Beloit and Rock County, generating $430 million in annual spending and supporting more than 4,300 jobs pre-pandemic. These jobs include everything from a 15-year-old's first position at a restaurant to a 45-year-old managing a hotel to a retiree working part-time at a local attraction. These jobs are at risk of being lost permanently if more is not done to support the needs of Visit Beloit and the small tourism-related businesses, many of which support low and medium income populations in our community. The funds provided to you have a high priority of being used to address the negative economic impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic, including speeding the recovery of impacted industries, such as the tourism, travel, and hospitality sectors. Additionally, the aid may be considered responsive to the negative economic impacts if it supports businesses and attractions that were operating prior to the pandemic and were affected by required closures and other efforts to contain the pandemic. The importance of the funds to the tourism sector take an even greater level of importance when considering that the negative impacts were due to the COVID-19 pandemic, as opposed to longer-term economic or industrial trends unrelated. Investing the funds into the tourism industry are a proven winner. For example, Wisconsin's tourism industry achieved a return of investment of 7-to-1, with $7 in tax revenue realized for every $1 in promotional spending. Without tourism, each local household would pay additional to maintain existing services. As we continue to act in the interest of public health and safety, it is important that we not allow the tourism-related businesses of our city to wither on the vine and close permanently. The resulting job losses would make the road to economic recovery much longer and only put our low and medium income populations further behind. Therefore, it is critical that you consider the ideas of Visit Beloit and small tourism-related businesses in your budget and action plan. I request your thoughtful consideration to future ideas that we submit. Thank you much.
Thank you. Would anyone else wish to submit a public comment or ask a question tonight?
Good evening. My name is Mardell Jacobson, 1442 Grant Street. I didn't come here expecting to speak tonight, and the presentation was great. It went a little quick, but as a former member of the Beloit Police and Fire Commission, it's never been within our scope to talk about budget and things. But having spent 5 years on the commission and realizing the importance of both of those entities, I'm not really sure what tactical equipment is, but I do understand about ambulance replacement. I think we're all pretty proud that our police department was a leader in using body cameras, and our fire department, all the additional things they did during COVID, including administering vaccines. So I would just say more information about that, and that is something I think would be a great thing to do within our community. And also I think it would also be great recognition for the increased time that the Police and Fire Commission did devote to COVID-19. Thank you.
Would anyone else wish to give a comment or ask a question tonight? Second call. Third and final call. This time we'll end, yes, City Manager Luther.
In the public comment,
Oh.
I was just gonna have some other comments.
Okay, well, at this time I'll end public comment and pass it to City Manager Luther.
Thank you. I just wanted to make it clear that this is just the first stop in what I think is likely to be a fairly lengthy process. We are going to be presenting the 2022 operating budget and the capital improvement plan. And there are only a handful of projects that were already included in the CIP that might be eligible for these funds, which would be a very small percentage of the total that has been allocated. And it really comes back to this concept that this is a once-in-a-lifetime, once-in-a-career opportunity, and we want to be very thoughtful and deliberate about how we move forward. We think that there are opportunities to look at where we can promote growth and expansion in Beloit as part of the equation, and we're not prepared yet to have a formal recommendation on that piece because we need additional analysis to be done and are likely to send out some RFPs for some consultant assistance to look at costing of water and sewer expansions that would benefit both existing residential areas and also provide an opportunity for both business and residential growth. We know that there are areas that once we're able to provide water and sewer will almost certainly be prime for future growth. And it, again, can benefit both our existing residents and provide opportunities that aren't currently cost effective in that growth factor. So we will need some additional assistance, and the Public Works Department is going to be leading that effort We are hoping to get some RFPs on the street yet this year so that we can get that data back and integrate it into future plans. This will be the first time since I arrived in Beloit, but I fully anticipate that we will be looking at an amendment to our capital plan next year. That we want to look at what is currently slated and where we need to focus the dollars that the city borrows on an annual basis to support our capital plan. But because these dollars are now also available, we will have the opportunity to amend the plan in 2022 to accommodate any projects that may be designed or built in 2022 or in future years. So we just wanted to have an opportunity prior to beginning the budget process formally to begin the public conversation. We've received a number of inquiries and questions about sewer projects, and we can speak to that a bit if you would like staff to address that particular issue. Lift stations and other sewer projects are incredibly expensive. And depending upon the size of a lift station, as an example, you're looking at hundreds of thousands to potentially up to $1 million. That also requires other sewer infrastructure near those facilities. So these are typically multi-million-dollar projects. And that's where we get to Eric's point, where you could very easily spend these dollars or other dollars allocated very quickly on, quite frankly, only a handful of those types of projects. So determining how we can best stretch the dollars and leverage them for long-range improvements, those are all things that we want to consider. And also look in the future to how we can enhance other services as well outside of the core infrastructure. We installed 2 splash pads at both Vernon and Summit Parks a little over a year ago, and those are very highly utilized. They happen to be located in parks that are in census tracts that were heaviest hit by COVID-19. It is possible that we might be able to use revenue replacement dollars in order to expand those or to place them in other parks throughout the city. But again, those are, roughly $350,000 approximately. So, each of those decisions needs to be weighed, and we just wanted to begin talking with the public about how that moves forward. The budget process will be another opportunity to speak in more specifics about the handful of projects that we think are likely to be elevated. For example, in the fire department, we have wanted to add ambulances to our fleet and replace aging ambulances for some time. We were able to accomplish one in 2021's budget, I believe it was. I get my years off. I'm looking to the finance director. Thank you. But increasing that fleet and replacing the existing fleet is an area that we know there is an existing current immediate need. And so that we just wanted to present a few options in that regard as well. So if there are questions, we are happy to respond to any questions and receive input on areas of interest. But I think the theme of the evening is that unlike most federal grants that I have experience with very quick turnaround times and very short periods of time in order to respond and get dollars out the door, if you will. This is an opportunity where we are provided with some time. And so I think that we should take advantage of it and also see where we see future projects in the city moving forward. Large projects like the Ho-Chunk Nation's Entertainment District. We've applied for several grant fundings for infrastructure improvements that are needed to support that type of a new development and the number of visitors that would be coming. If we are unsuccessful in those other grant pursuits, we may need to think about, how are we looking at areas like Colley Road, Willowbrook Road, areas that we know highly likely in the next 2 years will have significantly increased traffic counts. So I know it's a lot to take in. This presentation will be available on the city's website, and this meeting will be aired and available for viewing as well. But if there are any other questions, staff is certainly happy to field them the best we're able.
Thank you. At this time, are there any questions from council?
Yes, Mr. President.
Yes.
Is my
Councilor
light on?
Yep, you're good.
Is my windbreaker on? No. I just wanted to comment on the far-reaching effects of this funding. It's not just a look back on what we went through with COVID-19. It's definitely a look forward, and it'll continue to have an impact on our community for years to come. Is Eric still here? Hi, Eric.
Hi.
Hi. How many years into the future do you think we will be feeling the positive effects of this extra funding? Hi.
Yeah, I mean, into the foreseeable future would be the plan. We want to ensure that what we are doing does have a long-lasting impact, not just a short-term impact. Part of that sustainability, part of that big impact that we're trying to accomplish.
Other council questions? Yeah, Councilor Preschel?
Well, I said something to Lori last week, and I think to Regina this morning, that hopefully we'll be using these funds in a publicly visible manner, so that people can see they're doing something. It was my concern that some of this stuff would get buried under the ground in water pipes, and we'd never see nobody would be able to notice what we did with them, and they'll go, what did you do with all that money? And I'd rather not have that. And you know, as important as all that is, it's not very glamorous, it's not very visible. But I had one example for the city manager, and I still don't know if it's possible, but, you know, it's an annoyance to anybody who's lived on the west side as long as I have, that McKinley, between Burton and Newark, has no shoulders. And there's no way to get off the road for an ambulance or a fire truck going by, or to ride a bike out to head out to Big Hill Park that way. And it's always annoyed me, and it looks like it's primed and ready for a shoulder, but we never managed to find the money to put it out there. And I thought maybe there could be a way to fund that through the ARPA funding and get it done now rather than wait it off another, you know, how many years down the road. There's a terrible road on the west side, 1 block long, that needs much more than a surface treatment, and it's not on the schedule yet. So, you know, there's things like that. And they're very visible, and they're very obvious. And when you say, this is what we're doing with these ARPA funds, it should resonate with the people, and it should be across the city in all places. And I think one place, I'm sorry, I'm very, very selfish about McKinley. I know I live there, but it has nothing to do with that. It's just that anybody who's ever driven out that road, and I hope most of you have, will understand the dilemma there and look for a way to solve that problem. And that's one thing I think we should keep foremost in our minds while we're considering these funds and their uses, to do something very visible, very obvious, and very good for the most people, so everybody knows what we're using them for. So that's my point. That's my input.
You've raised a couple of issues that I think are important to address. One, I think we do need to be cognizant of the geographic locations of any physical improvements and looking at the entire city. I've been here long enough to know that there is some history from the east side and the west side. And certainly on the map that we displayed, you can see that there really is, just in that cursory view, that very quick review of the matrix, where we're looking at sub-6 inch water lines, where we're looking at road conditions that are subpar, where we're also looking at where we've had water main breaks. There's kind of an equal distribution there across those areas. And I think those are things we need to be cognizant of. In regard to street improvements, unfortunately, ARPA funds themselves cannot be used simply on a road improvement project. Now, if we are in the process of replacing water lines or sewer lines, and we are disrupting the road inevitably as part of that project, we are then able to make the necessary repairs, and that would be funded through ARPA. But if it was purely a road improvement project, that in and of itself would not be eligible. So we're really trying to see where can we maximize with this matrix of potential improvements in eligible areas the most bang for the buck, if you will. And that's just in its very cursory preliminary stages.
Councilor Levy?
Just a couple things while I'm talking. Eric, can you go back to the slide? You had one on there about revenue. But Lori, you read my mind when you were talking about we got to have equal balance on the entire city, being the east sider and Mark's the west sider. But I think since we want stuff to benefit the entire city, we need to make sure that whatever we plan to do with these dollars, we look at the entire city, all the areas, and seeing what we can do. I just believe that what we do in one area, we need to make sure that we do something in the other areas, not only for the residents, but also looking at businesses too. Because if we're talking about something that's going to affect the entire Beloit community and make Beloit a better place, as we continue to move in that direction, I think we need to look at all aspects, residential, businesses, and whatever, and see where we can utilize some of this, because this is not just to benefit just a certain group. So, but I think premium paid to essential workers during the public health, let's just say you wanted to do that. How would you structure that? It may be early to tell, but what that's kind of struck me as, how would you structure that? How would it be determined? So I would be interested in, if you can't answer tonight, I understand, but I'd be interested to see how would you even look at doing that, and how much would you allocate to that that could be pulling something away from something else that we would dire need. So that was a question that I had.
I can take a stab at that one. And Eric's always welcome to politely interrupt if there's a professional disagreement. In any case, I think in many ways we've already done this. Last December, prior to ARPA being awarded, prior to this even being a concept, we rewarded our employees with a 1% bonus. I call it a bonus because there's really not language to describe it differently. It was a 1% one-time payment that did not increase their base wage, but it recognized the extra effort that everyone went through last year. And I'm very proud of the fact that throughout the pandemic, we, for a time, paid employees to be home. We paid them to not be working when we were briefly shut down by the federal government. Or by the state, pardon me, that we, regardless of the workload, continued all of our employment and kept everyone on staff, had no layoffs, had no reductions in force, and had that one-time payment. And I focus on the fact that it was a one-time payment because any increase to base wages, we have to have a revenue stream to support in future years. And when our revenues outside of these one-time dollars have been very flat for the past several years, we need to be cautious about any impact that would have a permanent recurring effect on our budget. So I know that's not what employees want to hear, and certainly I don't want to display the message that I don't appreciate all of the very hard work that our staff has been doing. They're amazing and just make me proud of the public service profession every day. But I think we need to be very cautious when we look at things like premium pay because they have a long-term impact if they are increases to the base wage. And perhaps a more appropriate way to do that is, as we already did, in a one-time lump sum increase. And again, I think that that was helpful. It is a relatively, to the individual, relatively small amount of money, but I think it was a gesture that was certainly intended to demonstrate how much we appreciate the efforts that folks went through last year.
Okay. A couple other things when I'm looking at the negative economic impacts. Could programs be developed or invest in programs like for job readiness As we talk about new businesses coming to the city, making sure we have a workforce that's ready to go into some of the jobs that come in. Could some of the money be allocated to programs like that, or to fund things, or I'm just trying to think as we go along. And then also a passion of mine that I keep talking about, the homelessness. Is there something that we could look to address that? And I know Julie hears me all the time at CDA. This is one of the top things that I want us to look at. And I was encouraged with the parks and facilities as well, seeing how we could use some of this for that as well, and maybe improving some of the parks that have been, lack of a better term, neglected over the years because you haven't had the funding to do that. So I think those are some of the things that I would just wonder, but I was really curious with the job readiness. Didn't know if we could invest in programs that would assist with that, because that will too help the city as we continue to recruit new businesses coming to town.
So interestingly, you reminded me of something else. In addition to the funds that the city is receiving directly, there are other federal funds that are also being made available for a variety of other purposes. Some of those are coming directly to service providers through programs like the Community Development Block Grant Program that the city runs. Additional dollars are flowing into that program, and they have an established process that you're aware of, where there are applications that are reviewed and then funding recommendations are made. So there are additional dollars going to some of those assist people with homeless, that are homeless and need some supports. The other area is a different source of funds that has only recently been announced, and there was a recent meeting with the Wisconsin Economic Development Council. I know that Jen Hall, our new economic development director, is working directly with Blackhawk Technical College and some other individuals, the business education group through Greater Beloit Economic Development Corporation, and I believe partners at Beloit 200, to see if there is the possibility of applying for this other pot of funds that does exactly what you're saying. It is very driven towards workforce development and making sure that as new jobs are brought to Beloit, we have people in the area that have the skills that are needed to be eligible for those positions. So I can't speak in a great level of detail about that specific funding source, but I know that one does exist through the state, and there is at least a current effort underway to work on that issue to get an application pulled together.
I was going to say that hospitality training and development of that workforce would fall under what Celestino was talking about earlier. And I know that was always a part of Visit Beloit's agenda, is to work on that, because without that component, you've got nothing to, it's got to work.
So, we're getting home ARP funds, home ARP, and that those are actually targeted for homelessness, try to provide some better housing options for people either home. I just listened to a webinar today, coming up in the next 2 weeks. That pot for Rock County is, I think, our share is around 700,000, and we that might meet some above and beyond what Lori was talking about, where we also had CDBG CV money that went out to help some homeless agencies. This will focus kind of on the housing piece of it more, although there are some supportive services that are also eligible as part of it. We're just starting to dig into it. So and if you follow, there's a Badger Bounce Back. The state is gradually rolling out different programs with their ARPA funding. And one of the things is the housing authorities are to receive some rental assistance that people applied for through the state. And then we're getting it in terms of paying toward public housing, people's rent. And there's also water utility assistance for people who are having difficulty paying their water bill. So and that money's coming directly from the state. And they're working with our residents to help them directly. So there's a lot, Kevin, out there
Yeah.
in the social service realm that's available in this. I mean, when you look at, I signed up for the Badger Bounce Back, and they put out, was it last week or week before, a list of like 4 of them. And they've got more coming out that are available. And some cities can apply for, some, it varies. But there's a lot of funding out there. And, what Eric's talking about. So there's a lot of different programs out there. It's just, Kevin, it's like a lot.
Yeah.
Just keep track
And-
of-
and-
Laura
yeah.
and I were talking about that this afternoon.
And I believe that, so I'm glad to hear that, and I guess down the road, as we continue to move forward, I guess a question that I would be looking to ask is like that 700,000 that you're talking about, all of that do you know, it may be too early, is that all specified that it has to go towards homelessness, or can you put a piece of it to that and a piece of something else? Because I guess what I'm saying is, there's a program out there that's geared to addressing the homeless population, whatever the issue be, however much that money is, if it's the full 700,000, push all that to there, because otherwise we're kind of like where we are now if we can spread it around. But if we can allocate, this is what this money is for.
Actually, I'm going to interrupt real quick. Julie,
like I
can
said,
you?
we may not
No,
know
no,
all the
no, no, no,
details.
not that. Julie, can you come to the mic because this is being aired and the folks watching can't get the audio.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It's on camera.
Yeah.
So the home ARP funding I only had the overview webinar, so I'm not completely fluent in it, but it's geared towards giving you money to provide the capital funding, like maybe to increase your shelter capacity. You have to basically reach out to your community. We're gonna have to reach out to the funders and see what the greatest needs are. You can use it to build more rental housing, but that rental housing has to be for people who are either homeless or at risk of being homeless. So it's very narrow,
Good.
which home is always really narrow. They've opened it a little. They've reduced gotten rid of the match requirement. They've waived some of the requirements that could be problematic. But then there's also a part of it that can be used for tenant-based rental assistance. So you could take, if you find the greatest need is rental assistance, you could take and put it towards rental assistance.
Okay.
So it's really about identifying what the greatest need is. The downside to the, building housing is you have to find somebody to operate that housing long-term because they'd have to have the operating funds to continue. And you and us as the city receiving the funding would have to look into that.
Okay.
But we have to kind of reach out to the community, find out what the greatest needs are in terms of people who are either homeless or at risk of being homeless. And there's a section which relates to if somebody isn't homeless, and they don't pay more than 30% of their income for rent, but their overall expenses are at a high rate. So they are therefore at risk because their expenses are so high. And so they're really trying to target those people that, with no help, may be out of housing.
Right.
And so you have to figure out the best way to approach those needs.
Okay.
So, I think we're not in a position to say this is what we definitely need to do, but, and it's something that will come through CDA, which you're on, and through council, which you're on. So you will have a couple opportunities to be part of that discussion.
Good. Thank you.
Counselor Duncan?
Yeah,
Oh, Mike. There you go.
okay. I just wanted to acknowledge that we did receive public comments from some residents off of Hart Road regarding a possible lift station, and that, I know, Laura, you spoke to this earlier about being able to weigh out the cost analysis, and so I know that as the council will be prioritizing and looking at some of those things. But that said, my question is, what is the next step in this process? And what is the time frame for the RFP getting out to members of the public?
So I think the next official part of the process where there's any chance of any dollars being allocated would be through the approval of the operating budget. I'll be submitting, Eric and I'll be submitting the recommended budget to the council. Correct me if I'm wrong on this, there are no ARPA dollars tied to the operating budget whatsoever. Again, We think it's important that these be tied to one-time cost, which are more naturally dovetailing into our capital plan. There will likely be a handful of projects that were already included in out years to be ready for 2022 with relatively small amounts of funding tied to them for consideration through that process. That will go to, there will be a presentation on October 4th, I believe it is. There will be a workshop a week following, and then there will be a public hearing this last meeting in October, and adoption typically takes place in the first meeting in November. I do not have specific dates. There are a couple of different RFPs for studies, primarily in the area of water and sewer extension, that we are hoping to get out by the end of the year. I do not know the length of time that it will take to pull the data together to complete those studies. What I anticipate is having responses back in 2022 that may or may not instigate further design or potential construction. That's where the potential amendment to the 2022 CIP plan is being considered. So I think all of these are completely public processes. The budget itself will be coming forward. All of that information is always completely available online, as well as in hard copies at a variety of locations, such as the public library. So we are committed to making this a completely transparent process. And again, we're not looking to how quickly can we write a check for $7.6 million, but how can we have a collaboration with public input and then with staff and other consultant evaluation to make recommendations, again, looking for those long-term significant impacts to the community as a whole.
Councilor Preschel?
Just to clarify again, because we've mentioned this a couple times, but so we could have a multi-year project that begins in 22, say for design and bids go out, and and this could go on for a multi-year project could begin in 22 and end in 26, and that would qualify for spending of these funds. So it could be a staged project. It could be something big or something small, or many small things that parts of them start one year, follow up the next year, because we do have things called seasons around here. And I just want to make that clear that these, even though it's a one-shot spend, it might take 2 or 3 years to spend some of it.
I would fully anticipate that. And again, so those deadlines, we have to officially award the funds or obligate the funds by December 31st of 2024. The dollars don't have to be officially expended out the door, so to speak, until December 31st of 2026.
Okay, so I just wanted to make sure that, and these are coming in 2 different years. These funds are split in half. Is it exactly half? That's what I thought I was reading. It seemed odd that it was just, it seemed odd that it was just an exact number like that, because there were two bills passed, and I just thought that was interesting. But so we can anticipate next year having an amendment to our budget plans, and probably do that in the next couple of years as we proceed, huh? In this, be very interesting times.
Mr. President,
Yes.
one area that we didn't spend a great deal of time talking about in regard to broadband infrastructure. So the ARPA dollars themselves are intended to help more rural communities that don't have internet activity or very reliable internet access. However, one area where we may want to consider partnering with neighboring jurisdictions, if you will, is in regard to how we might use the dollars from revenue replacement, where we have a little more flexibility, and looking to make connections with Rock County, the school district, other entities that we can then share that high-speed internet. It's important from a redundancy standpoint, so critical city services are provided off of our internet connections. Things that may not be as visible, as you said, Councilman Preschel, but certainly are very critical. Information related to our water plant and to maintaining the water quality and how we're receiving alarms when we need to make adjustments at the plant, as an example. All of that is done electronically. And to the extent that we can get connected to Rock County with fiber that we could own or co-own, we then can provide each agency with redundancy, security. It assists with cybersecurity. It assists with a great number of things. We've been gradually working towards this over several years. We now own more fiber in the ground than we ever did before. But there are some connections that we can make with other public partners that I think could be mutually beneficial. So we are also looking at that design to see how we can partner. This includes organizations like Black Hawk Technical College and others where we could do some joint projects and work with our neighbors as well. So they're also ideas that we want to vet further.
Thank you. Any other questions or discussion from council? If not, I would just say thank you to everybody who gave up their Monday night to come out to this workshop. I don't believe we need a motion to adjourn since it is a workshop, so thank you, everybody.
Thank you.